Recontextualizing Ancient Pottery. Ancient Poetry. I apologize. Um, so the the poetry of the ancient Greeks has spurred a lot of reception and curiosity all through the ages since then. This particular panel, we're going to highlight some of the very different and disparate outcomes of that trend, everything from comic books to the great novels of our time to queer celebrations and pop music. So I think this is going to be very exciting for everyone, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing our presenters. To start us off, we will be having on our first paper from Epameinondas Kazolis, Ancient Greece in Comics, a study on a study of the adaptations of the comedies of Aristophanes in comic books. So Epa began his bachelor's studies as a student at the Department of History and Ethnology at Democritus University of Thrace, Komotini, in Greece. During his years as a bachelor's student, he developed his knowledge and love for ancient Greek history, especially the Hellenistic period, and wrote his thesis titled The Abandonment of Countryside in the Hellenistic Peloponnese. He also received his certificate of educational competence and taught contemporary Greek literature at the Intercultural General High School of Sapis during the spring semester of 2016-2017. After receiving his bachelor's in 2019, Epa moved to the Netherlands to pursue a research master's at the University of Groningen in classical, medieval, and early modern studies, specializing in ancient Greek history, particularly city foundation and immigration during the Hellenistic period, writing a thesis on the early Antigonid settlements. He participated in the research project Connected Contests, directed by Professor Onno van Neef and Dr. Christina Williamson, collecting the names of the Nemeonikai, my apologies on the pronunciation, Nemeonikai, and adding them to the project's online database. He also participated in the ongoing project Ancient Colonization, directed by Dr. Jeremiah Pellegrom, for which he collected the data on Ptolemaic colonies. He's also developed an interest in the reception of antiquity in the modern world, especially in pop media, like video games and comic books. He's worked as an archive intern at the War Museum of Athens, and since 2022, he has been a volunteer with SASA's Archaeogaming Education team, which you'll hear about later. He's helping to work on new teaching activities and recordings for Archaeogaming education modules, and they'll be incorporated into custom free lesson plans that are available to middle school teachers. Epa, welcome. I hope you were able to hear that introduction. All of your lovely accomplishments, please do go ahead and come on. We are ready for you to begin.
Thank you. And thank you for having me to this wonderful conference. Let me share my screen. If you would be... There we go. So as it was said, I will speak about ancient Greek comedy, particularly Aristophanes, and the adaptation that he received in the comic books. First, a little bit about humor, though. Now, humor is, I use the release theory of humor in my studies, which is the way humor is used through which humans find relief from pent-up emotions. With the relief theory, difficult topics become easier to approach, while the mundane turns interesting. My question is, can we trace differences in the use of similar humorous materials in different historical periods? And if so, how can we then use these materials to teach history and modern-day issues? As a case study, I use the comedies of Aristophanes and their 1980s comic book counterparts. I will mainly focus on the Achernians and the Knights during this presentation. Now, a little bit of Aristophanes and his time. We are in Athens in the second half of the 5th century BC. During this time, It is the period of the First Athenian League, with an alliance of Greek city-states under Athens. By 454, we speak more of an Athenian empire, since the Athenians moved the alliance treasury from Delos, its original place, to the Acropolis. The Athenian expansionist policy led to the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and their allies and Sparta and their allies, which resulted in the defeat of Athens in 404 BC. War dominated every political and cultural and social aspect of life in the period, and that Aristophanes, which lived during this time, was heavily influenced by these events. Aristophanes was born sometime around the 450s, and he is our only representative of old comedy, whose works survived to full till this day. His first play was directed by Callistatus, and it is called The Banqueteers. The Knight is the first play written and directed by Aristophanes himself. He has 11 surviving plays out of at least 40, and he managed to acquire at least 4 victories in major dramatic contests. His works are characterized by political satire. He usually attacked against demagogues and politicians, much like Lamachus and Cleon. He also attacked the social life of Athenians of the day. Their love for litigiousness is heavily satirized in Wasps, or the division of wealth in Athens is the theme of the comedy Plutus. The Achaemenians was produced in 425. In this play, a peace-loving farmer, Diciopolis, goes against the militaristic elite of Athens. He manages to acquire a peace treaty with the Spartans for 30 years only by himself, and convinces the Athenians to allow him to establish a free trade zone in the city, where both Athenians, their allies, but also Peloponnesians and their allies can come visit and trade freely without fear of persecution. In the play, the causes of the war become apparent. The main cause, as Aristophanes claims, is that Athenians stole 2 Megarian girls, and in retribution, the Megarians, which were allies of Sparta, stole an Athenian girl. In addition, another very highly point in the play are the public servants, which take a lot of money from the public treasury of Athens and spend their time abroad in safety, away from the perils of war, while Diciopolis and other Athenians have to serve in the banquets. So the theme of the Achaemenians is also the humanization of the enemy. During the play, enemies from Megara and Thebes, cities which belong to the Peloponnesian League, visit Athens to trade. We see that they also face similar problems because of the war. Diciopolis becomes such an anti-hero. He goes against the social norms which want all the Athenians to fight for the glory and of their city. But secretly, at least according to Aristophanes, every Athenian desires for peace. The Achaemenians managed to win the first place at the Linnea festival. Moving on to the Knights, they were produced in 424 BC. Another political satire, which is mainly the caricature of Cleon, the political leader of Athens during the period of the Peloponnesian War. Cleon is presented as a Paphlagonian slave. Paphlagonians were considered by Athens to be quite bad orators, in the sense that they were quite vulgar in their speech. In the play, it is said that even a sausage seller, which is the main protagonist of the play, could be a better leader for Athens. The contest between Cleon and the sausage seller turns into a shameless and unscrupulous orator fight. This also managed to win the first prize at the Linnea Festival. Now let's move on to the comic books. We are now in the 1980s. The world is much like in ancient Greece. It's torn apart between the two superpowers of the day, the USA from the one hand and the Soviet Union from the other, during the period known as the Cold War. In Greece this time, which belongs to the west side, in Thessaloniki, Tassos Apostolidis and Yorgos Epoukalidis decided to adapt the comedies of Aristophanes in comic books. They managed to produce what was missing from the plays. We only had the text, and now we can finally have some images according to the imagination of the authors and the artists. They use the grotesque but realistic technique. They mix ancient and modern Greek traditions. And the target audience, in this case, is teenagers, not simply adults. The vulgar language of the Aristophanic comedies is now censored in a great length. And the comics have an educational function as well. In the beginning of each comic book, there is an abstract of the play and the situation, the historical situation around it. The Acarnanians in this game are a satire against the Cold War. In the first edition of the comic book, we can see the caricature of several war leaders of the time, such as Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and others. In later editions, these leaders were replaced by more generic figures. They also satirize local political debates, such as the color of the taxicabs, very mundane issues, while the world is literally almost engulfing into war. This time, the enemies from the original play are replaced by Greek rustic figures. The Knights satirize the election process. During this period, the Greek politics were dominated by two main political parties, PASOK and the Nea Demokratia. PASOK were the socialistic party and more progressive, while Nea Demokratia is supposed to be the neoliberal party. Cleon, this time, which was hidden behind the Paphlagonian slave in the original play, is no longer behind the mask. However, both Cleon and Agoraclitus, the sausage seller, are now the mask for the Greek politicians. We can see here in the page from the play how the Greek debates were taking place at the time, where graffitis were written all over the walls. Flyers were thrown all over the place, while figures who would call for a peaceful debate, showing respect to both sides, such as Euripides here, the tragic poet, are taken by nobody into account. In the meantime, opponents of different political parties fight each other in the background. The comic book has an educational character, as it tries to teach us about the social classes in ancient Athens. Now, how can we use those comic books as a teaching material? Studies such as the one by Sabrani and others have demonstrated the positive effects of humor in the educational environment. We can see several benefits by using comic books. They present the material in a form which can pique the student's interest. The events of the distant past become closer to our time, while the profanities of the original material are now avoided. The authors of the comic books have actually proposed a fun activity for students where they will receive blank dialogue clouds and they will fill them out themselves. So it's like with this way, knowledge does not come exclusively from the teacher or the handbook, but it is created both by the student and the teacher. There are, of course, several problems with the use of comic books, which should be taken into account. Humor is culturally specific, and what works in some cases doesn't necessarily work in others. Oversimplification can also be a problem because several of these issues that are discussed in comic books are quite great, or social issues like gender politics, and we needed to be very careful on how we try to transmit those issues on others. Also, we need to be very careful for the reproduction of the myth that history repeats itself, something that doesn't happen, even though we might see some similarities between the past and current events. That is all about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Epa. That was really interesting. Chat, please do feel free to add your comments and questions. We've got a cute little comment here. It says Cleon only wears a mask when he's a superhero. So I guess let me ask you, do you think Cleon is a superhero?
Uh, Cleon, the original one, was definitely not a superhero. No, Aristophanes had to put a mask on him in his play at the time because, well, according to himself in the Acarnanians, he was prosecuted by Cleon for a previous play, which presented the Athenians in a very bad fashion in front of foreigners. Now, the historicity of this event is to be questioned, of course, but still, Cleon was a very powerful figure of the day, and going against powerful politicians isn't always the best idea. He was known for having many informants and many sycophants in Athens in order to control the Athenians, thanks to their law for litigation.
Um, so I wanted to ask you about the medium of comic books and how that fits uh in a larger picture of how we see comic books. You mentioned the educational aspects of it and the very, sort of intentional educational aspects of using a comic book that sort of uh, has an express intended audience. And I don't know about Greece in the 80s, but certainly in the US in the 80s, that intended audience would have been children, right? Which is no longer necessarily the case. So I wanted to ask, for the context of this comic book, who was the expected audience in Greece?
Yes, the expected audience were teenagers and still mainly are teenagers. The author of the comic books was also a high school teacher himself, a mathematician actually, weirdly enough. Uh, and he was very interesting in trying to make the students of Greece at the time familiar with the works of Aristophanes. Of course, everyone can read those plays, and many jokes may pass over the head of teenagers as they are not very familiar with political issues or some other social issues. So everyone can read those plays, those comic books. They are actually translated in the English, German, Turkish, I believe, as well. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they were also preparing a translation in Chinese.
That's fascinating. So there have actually been a lot of newer comic books focusing on ancient Greek poetry and ancient Greek stories. Have you looked into, for instance, the retelling of the Iliad in comics that I know is sort of ongoing, or any of those newer comic books in sort of comparing how these older educational materials from the 80s compare to what's happening now?
I definitely plan to do so, but unfortunately did not have the time to check the newer comic books so far. I really wanted to focus more on Greek created comic books for the time because we do not have that big of a market nor that big
Mm,
of a comic book creating tradition in Greece. Definitely not the same as, let's say, in France and Belgium for Europe or the US. Uh,
yeah,
but
classically
yes,
themed comics in France are a bit of a big deal.
but yeah, there are
Asterix is a familiar figure.
As Asterix is a great figure. But yeah, there are some very fun. One that I actually read is Japanese manga called Historian, I think is pronounced, which focuses on Epimenides of Cardia, which was a general of Alexander the Great.
Wow, I haven't heard of that one.
A
Uh,
very
there
interesting
there are more
topic.
coming out all the time. I know about. I mean, my favorite that I've encountered recently. It's not new, but I've recently encountered Thermae Romae, and I just it's amazing.
I saw the Netflix
The
series. Yes,
anime.
it was so fun. Yes. And
Um,
I cannot believe that this would be the way a Roman person would react in modern day focus, especially the one episode which even needs to create a full bath for a rich Japanese person. That was so true.
oh dear. Um, so we do have a question from chat.
Nice.
How do we explain the need to integrate humor in exploring these plays in terms of like there's a huge push to use humor as a vehicle, but there's also a huge backlash, right, to treating these subjects like elections, like politicians' lives, like other things that Aristophanes talks about, like religion, and there's a huge pushback to treating these subjects lightly. So how do we talk about
Right.
the vehicle of humor?
Yes, there is always the danger of ridicule, right? This is uh, a big word in the mouths of the backlash supporters. Um, but in the end, we needed to make these topics approachable to newer generations. And just going, I personally believe that just going to school and saying, kids, you should vote. It just uh, doesn't make the trick.
Yes, because
Uh,
telling kids what to do always works.
yes, exactly. um, it makes things more fun, more interesting to use humor, and much more engaging. Much like with the need to use video games to teach ancient history. It can make the students to actually pay much more attention, much closer attention than they would if it was just a textbook and the lecturer giving them a speech about a topic. It needs to be done with great care, of course. Like not only to avoid the ridiculing the topics, but also, for instance, in Aristophanes, the original material is so profane in a language that you really cannot use it in a high school environment. There, for example, there are he ridicules homosexuals in Thesmophoriazice, or there is lots of bad-mouthing women, both again in Thesmophoriazice or Lysistrata, for example. And
Yeah,
this
things which need to be adapted to a modern
exactly,
context.
exactly.
Um,
We need to create to recreate those works to match modern interests and modern needs.
mhm. Um, so I have a question actually um about choosing Aristophanes as a vehicle, right? Because Aristophanes uh was himself quite conservative in
As
his own
yeah,
context.
that's what
And
it
so you
seems.
mentioned
Yes,
you mentioned in your talk that the two main parties in Greece when these came out were the neoliberals, who are
the
to modern
conservatives.
Americans,
Yes,
that sounds like that sounds
yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah.
left. It's not. But that's probably
The,
our
they are
our center.
they are the neoliberals in Greece are the conservative
Hmm.
party, the
And then there's
yeah,
a more left wing, a communist
the
party,
socialist.
socialist party.
Socialist is the right word. Is it in there in the name? Actually,
My
that was
apologies.
no, no, it's fine.
So I guess I'm just interested in, given that my context is the US where we don't have any kind of left party, um, coming in with a conservative, a deeply conservative author from ancient Greece to talk about modern elections where the elections are much more left wing, uh, relatively speaking.
Yes, okay. Well, as we said before, we adapted the original material, right? We can adapt it to our modern day needs, and eventually, yes, Aristophanes is conservative only because he perceives politicians like Cleon to be extremely destructive for Athens. Cleon is characterized as an anti-intellectual, someone who simply tries to have small short-term gains for himself, basically, and his very close circle of friends. He basically what's the word? There was a chance during his generalship for a peace treaty between Sparta and Athens, and he sabotaged it because he wanted to continue the war. He thought that only by continuing the war, the Athens would be safe. So Aristophanes wanted peace, and he thought that going back to a time where everyone was interested in politics and the proper men, the well-educated men, were the ones that were leading the people. Don't forget, we are speaking for immediate democracy. They are not a representative democracy, which has a huge difference in practice. Uh, those people like Aeschylus, who was Aristophanes' greatest idol in terms of poets. They would be the best suited to lead the city. So in terms, even if you consider him conservative, it's really a matter of understanding what the conservative of the time meant against what the conservative today means. It's very nuanced, like so.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Epa. This was a really interesting talk. And it's so much more than comic books. I
Oh yes.
really was very curious to see where you were going with this. So thank you so much. What a wonderful talk.
Thank you for
And
the opportunity.
folks in chat have been applauding you. So just so you know, everybody check the chat. It's great.
Thank
Um,
you.